Welcome to something special. Welcome to TedX. This TedX event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the 10th anniversary of TEDx London Business School. I'm Andrew from the forests of Trinidad.
Hi, I'm Duarte, calling in from Brazil.
And I'm Jabo, here in exotic, sunny, but indoor London.
The three of us are MBA students at London Business School and are part of the organising team for this TEDx. And because David Attenborough just called to cancel, you'll be stuck with us as your co-MCs for the next 2 evenings or days, depending on your current time zone. Addressing the elephant in the room, this is not how you or us envisioned this event. You probably saw the reminder emails and were doubtful whether or not you would have the courage to turn on your computer once again for another virtual moment that should have been physical.
And that's why we want to thank you, more than ever, for giving us a chance and for being here with us tonight, even after everything that has happened and is happening in the world, in the lives of those close to you, and in your own life.
We want this to be a special moment where you can actually take a break, unwind. Just go grab your favorite drink, sit on a couch, connect your laptop to the TV, or whatever makes you feel good.
What you will watch and listen to this week is not meant to stay here, lost in your memory or on the archives of the internet. It is meant to inspire you throughout your life, and it's for you to share with everyone willing to listen.
Our theme this year is Mind the Gap. And for the next 2 evenings, each of the 12 talks and performances you will watch will touch on the various gaps our society faces and the opportunities that arise. Our speakers will tackle topics ranging from terrorism to theatre, medical sciences to music, and fake news to fascism. Now, over to Jabo to introduce our first speaker for this evening.
When I first tried to approach Julia Ebener, it took me quite some time and effort to find her real contact information online. As an expert in counterterrorism, Julia actually went undercover into real terrorist and extremist groups in order to acquire first-hand information. And I guess that's the reason she turned off the DM function on her Twitter, just to avoid retaliation. Today, Julia is going to give all of us a wake-up call about a new form of inspirational terrorism. Let's welcome Julia.
When I'm out for a run, I sometimes imagine the pedestrians behind me as zombies so that I run faster. When I give a speech in front of a large audience, I sometimes turn the people in front of me into robots in my head so that I'm less nervous. And when I come back to a flooded inbox of emails after a long holiday, I usually reward myself for every 20th I finish. Most of us gamify our daily lives, whether consciously or unconsciously, to make situations less boring, less intimidating, or simply more fun. Gamification is the art of putting game-like elements into product, services, or situations that are not games. Employers use it to increase employee motivation. You have interactive ranking systems, real-time progress bars, and achievement updates that give you an incentive to perform better. Uber drivers, for example, immediately see their customer ratings and opportunities to make more money. Some of the drivers I spoke to even became addicted to seeing their progress bars go up. Companies also exploit gamification mechanisms to enhance customer loyalty. Some members of frequent flyer programs, for example, would even choose multi-city trips over direct flights just so that they can gain additional miles. And some McDonald's customers would even buy an additional burger just to have a higher chance at winning the McDonald's monopoly. As early as 100 years ago, Kellogg's already put little games into its cornflakes boxes to create a more playful family atmosphere. Today, entire business models are based upon gamification. Think about dating apps, for example. What would Tinder be without the fun swiping mechanisms? We're getting into more sensitive territory when we enter gamification for political gains. Political campaigners and activists have increasingly started to gamify their campaigns to steer votes into a certain direction. I have to say there are some of these political games that I enjoy quite a bit that involve particular politicians, for example. Gamified approaches to business and politics work because they tap into our competitive instincts and into our love for entertainment. Unfortunately, gamification has also become the favorite weapon used by modern-day extremists. For my book Going Dark, The Secret Social Lives of Extremists, I went undercover with a dozen different extremist groups across the ideological spectrum. I spent 2 years infiltrating ISIS hacker groups, female misogynist channels, and the white nationalist networks that radicalized the Christchurch perpetrator. From jihadists to neo-Nazis, extremists have become increasingly good at exploiting gamification to their advantage. They recruit young members using video game-like vetting procedures. They run communication campaigns using military language and promoting successful participants to higher ranks in the community. And most recently, they have even started to gamify their acts of terrorism. Some of them are better than advertising firms and political campaigners. Some violent extremist communities have created entire online worlds where they use their own vocabulary, hierarchies, and incentive systems. One neo-Nazi trolling army I infiltrated counted 10,000 foot soldiers that were receiving daily orders from the so-called Supreme Commander to carry out hate attacks. In March 2019, an Australian far-right gunman killed over 50 Muslims in 2 consecutive mosque attacks. He live-streamed his attack using a first-person ego shooter angle, and his so-called manifesto was littered with gaming references. The first reply to his livestream post was, "Is this a LARP? Is this a live-action roleplay?" And many of his fans in his community then turned the video footage into video game-like versions, where his scores would go up and his ammunition would go down with every Muslim he shot. Half a year later in Halle, Germany, another far-right perpetrator even used a 3D printer to print his own weapons, something that's called weapons crafting in gaming. I watched the members of these communities where the perpetrators radicalized from the inside, and it was shocking to see how many of the members could no longer distinguish between what's a game and what's real. The lines between trolling and terrorism, between fiction and reality, have become increasingly blurry. Video games turn into LARPs, LARPs turn into terrorist attacks, and terrorist attacks are turned back into video games. Sadly, games are repeatable. Last year, we witnessed a series of attacks from Christchurch, Poway, El Paso to Halle, which all followed a similar pattern, one mimicking the next one. There is a real threat that this has become a competition for higher scores. In some channels, extremists even discuss beating the Norwegian far-right terrorist Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in 2011 and is the undisputed winner of these terrorist games. Similar to the wave of ISIS-inspired copycat attacks that we saw in 2016, we're now seeing a new form of inspirational terrorism, gamified terrorism. The era of gamified terrorism is not about video games per se. Clearly, problematic video games exist. There's, for example, white power modifications of popular games such as Counter-Strike, where you can only shoot Muslims, blacks, or Jews. While these kind of games can be dangerous pathways into radicalization, I don't think we should stop playing video games altogether. And I would certainly not want to stop using gamification. Imagine how dull the coronavirus lockdown would have been without using games to escape reality. You can't ban everything, neither from a practical perspective nor from a freedom of speech perspective. The takedowns of harmful online materials will always stay a cat and mouse game. And additionally, extremists have become increasingly good at camouflaging their extreme ideologies. Often satirical content falls into a legal gray zone, even when it's used to spread racist ideologies. There are nevertheless ways to reduce the malevolent power that can come out of gamification. In my research, I saw how many members of image boards such as 4chan were frustrated because they felt that these forums that were meant for entertainment, fun, and taboo breaking were hijacked by extremists and turned into politicized forums. Maybe there's a way of reconquering those gaming spaces and reconverting them into what they were originally designed for: fun. To effectively counter the spread of violent extremism under the cloak of memes and games, we need better education programs that go beyond teaching digital literacy. It's important that young generations are taught about extremist subcultures and their manipulation techniques, so that they can spot the early warning signs when they encounter them. Moreover, we need more online intervention programs that tap into some of these fringe boards and messaging boards. There are plenty of successful offline de-radicalization models, such as one-on-one mentoring programs with trained psychologists and former extremists. Why not adapt some of these for the darker online spaces? To end on a positive note, I'm optimistic for our future generations. If I wasn't, you wouldn't see me with this belly today. I will let my children play video games, and I will let their imagination as much freedom as they need to develop a creative mind. But I will tell them to be careful when they notice that games turn political. And I will also warn them of the dangers that can arise from forgetting where a game ends and where reality starts.
Thank you so much, Julia Angel Baby, who just delivered his first ever TEDx talk. If you want to know more about Julia's research, please do check out her new book, Going Dark: The Secret Social Lives of Extremists. Now, I'm pretty sure that all of us are aware that gamification could potentially be abused by modern terrorists. However, we also need to understand that gamification, once used properly, has the power to create a much bigger positive social impact on our future generations. Now, please let me introduce our next speaker, Giri Kesavan, a current MBA student at London Business School. Giri is going to demonstrate how he used simple board games to improve education in Kenya. Over to you, Giri.
Snakes and Ladders. It's a game everyone knows and loves. Originally called Moksha Pratam in North India, it was created in the 2nd century AD and focuses on a life journey complicated by virtues, which are the ladders, and vices, which are the snakes. The game focuses on identifying your goal, accepting outcomes, keeping on moving, and controlling the risk and not the reward. Indeed, people pray not to land on a snake rather than praying to land on a ladder. It was popularized in 1943 by Milton Bradley, who's the pioneer of the board game industry, and he commercialized this in the UK and the US. And Snakes and Ladders really predates any formal system of language, education, politics, and even common law. Initially, it was meant to reinforce the teachings of Hinduism in a practical way without having to resort to physical books, and designed to teach and communicate through experience. So the question was, can Snakes and Ladders actually influence behavior, and can board games influence behavior? So a study last year by Professor Mitsuhiro Nako looked at this very phenomenon. In a randomized control experiment comparing teaching through traditional methods as well as teaching through board games that promoted health education, he found that over 2/3 of participants had a higher knowledge-based test score 3 months after this intervention. So the next question was, how can we leverage that concept to bring key education to those who need it most? Meet Victor Otineo, a 14-year-old from Nairobi in Kenya. His parents live on around 400 Kenyan shillings a day. It's about £3. And his attendance record at school is less than 20% due to the inability of his parent to pay regular school fees. He studies at Gachoka Primary School on the outskirts of Nairobi. It's a public school with about 120 pupils, focused on art, English, and maths, as well as teaching children childcare, cooking, and general exercise. So it's focused on the core subjects in the classroom, but sorely missing the physical, social, and health education that we fundamentally take for granted in the Western world. Indeed, PSHE isn't really a concept in Kenya. It's not part of the curriculum of schools. In 2015, the Kenyan government realized this and published a plan called the Education for All Act. They identified key areas of improvement. They found that students had inadequate knowledge on values and life skills. There was indulgence in risky behavior, especially drug abuse, and negative peer pressure. There was inadequate communication skills, and there was a lack of capacity, information, and role models that children could really look up to. This all led to about 25% of primary school-age pupils not even enrolled in school, leading to 1.2 million illiterate population. Drug abuse was the key issue. The awareness rate was so low, 20% of participants aged 9 to 15 understood the dangers of drug abuse. Alcohol, cigarettes, and cut, which is similar to speed, had positive associations in 73% of the student population. And shockingly, the median age for the first use of these drugs is just 9 years old. So this is Charles Macharia, a trained social worker in the UK and a Kenyan national. He is a social and academic counsellor for 4 schools in Nairobi, and in 2008 he started the MASH Foundation Trust, focusing on sponsoring pupils throughout the education system in Kenya. He set up programs to empower, educate, and support communities, especially orphans and vulnerable children in Kenya. And I've been working with Charles since 2013 as part of a program to bring international volunteers out to Nairobi and teach life skills, health, safety, hygiene, drug abuse education, and morals to children. So we sat down after our trip to Kenya in 2013 and looked at how we can sustainably and scalably teach life skills and impart these learnings to children in a scalable fashion. So we thought, let's take a concept that everyone knows so well and repurpose it for social education, particularly on drug abuse. So we adapted well-loved, highly visible board games that children already play in a social context and infused a moral element to these games. So we created Ludo and Snakes and Ladders with a difference and with a purpose. It's almost going back to the 2nd century concept of virtues and values through board games and stripping away the commercialization that's happened in the following centuries. So here you can see our drug abuse and healthy living Ludo and road safety Snakes and Ladders. Created and printed locally in Kenya with the purpose of leveraging board games to influence behavior. Focusing on drug abuse to start with, as our target was to increase awareness and promote positive peer pressure and change that positive association with hard drugs. We took the key findings from the Education for All report, focusing on the key areas of weakness and mitigated those themes through these board games, focusing on reinforcing good behavior, raising awareness of key issues, and teaching this in a fun, engaging way that students would actually remember, and teaching through a collaborative manner as opposed to just talking. So we got approval from the Ministry of Education and did a limited print of these games that we then launched in 14 schools around Nairobi. So once we got the approval from the Ministry of Education, we then took these board games out into schools. We started with 3 pilot schools, Gachoka, Kasarani, and Gianchiru, covering over 300 students, focusing on the ages of 9 to 14. We split children into groups of 5 to 6 and literally played board games with them as a fun and social activity. We saw that kids were extremely engaged as they loved the concept of having fun while they were learning. Crucially, we followed up with schools and the community after our pilot program to see the impact. And it was amazing. Positive attitudes towards hard drugs had dropped by 60%. We found that peer pressure caused a cyclical effect. Children now had role models within themselves, and they were reinforcing their own good behavior, following the crowd in a good way. And among the adult population, we saw reverse teaching. Kids were taking these board games home and talking about their learnings with their parents, resulting in a 70% awareness increase in the adult population on substance abuse in these communities. And therefore, we created a cyclical and sustainable learning pattern that covered generation to generation on the dangers of substance abuse through a very, very simple concept. We didn't need major socioeconomic studies, we didn't need a complex education training regime, we didn't need to overcomplicate the number of stakeholders involved, we just took a very simple concept of board games to influence student behavior. And in the next year, we're expanding this initiative out to Tanzania and Uganda, as well as augmenting our board games with additional topics, in particular focusing on hygiene and hand washing. As Leonardo da Vinci once said many years ago, simplicity is the ultimate form of sophistication. We took a very complex socio-economic problem in Kenya, broke it down into its fundamental layers, and created an initiative that caused maximum impact. Resources were simply not a constraint for us. We just had to be smart in how to utilize, allocate, and leverage what we had at our disposal to add value to the communities. It's easy to be complicated, but simplicity is really an art. And I hope that this small initiative in board games has demonstrated how impactful that ethos can be. Thank you very much.
Ingenious stuff. Thank you, Giri, for showing us how gamification can also be used for good and how our brains are wired to take these inputs and make learning more exciting. Our next speaker will now show us another fascinating aspect of how our brains work. You know how you just need to listen to 1 second of some songs to immediately know exactly what's playing? Our next speaker will tell you why that happens. With a PhD in neuropsychology, she has studied in depth the connection between music and memory for years, and her research shows how music means much more to all of us than you might think. Please welcome Catherine Loveday.
A few years ago, I was walking through the Christmas markets in Dublin. I was deeply engrossed in conversation, having a really lovely time with my husband, and then suddenly a piece of music came out over the loudspeakers, and I found myself overwhelmed with emotion. I had tears rolling down my cheeks. That piece of music was my dad's favourite Christmas song. It was When a Child is Born by Johnny Mathis. I was a complete mess. And the reason is that it had completely taken me back to my childhood Christmases and the warmth and the love and the belonging and the excitement. And I suddenly felt overwhelmed with nostalgia, with grief, but also with happiness as well. It was a strange mixed emotion. And these are the kinds of things that we hear people saying all the time about music. Nostalgia is one of the most commonly used words to describe people's emotional responses to music. Music attaches itself to our lifetime memories, really, but there are two really significant things about that experience. The first thing is the immediacy with which that hit me, with the recognition of the song. It was so instant, and we know this now from research that we have very quick recognition of songs within something like half a second of songs that we know. And we also know that those musical memories are really incredibly robust. So right into old age, we will still recognize those songs. And even people who develop dementia can still have access to those songs. We know from neuroimaging research that songs are stored in a relatively safe part of the brain. The medial prefrontal cortex seems to have an important role in this. And it's part of the reason why our musical memories seem to be so robust. The second striking thing about that experience was the vividness and the automatic way in which that memory came to mind. I had no choice. It was with me. And I was absolutely immersed back in that moment. It took me back to a very visceral experience. I want to do a thought experiment. I want you to imagine going to a desert island and the only thing you can take with you is 8 songs. Which pieces of music would you take with you and why? Luckily for us, the BBC have been running this experiment for the last 75 years. They've been asking guests to come on and to consider this question, and we've been examining their responses. Some people just say they love the music. It makes them feel good. They love the performance. They love the lyrics. Sometimes people just say, oh, I love this song because it makes me want to get up and dance, or I think it would make me feel happy, or it would calm me down. But actually, more than 50% of the time, people choose a piece of music because it reminds them of something significant. And that may be a period of time, it may be a specific place, it may be a very key moment in their life. But actually the most common reason that people choose a piece of music to take to a desert island is because it reminds them of a person, someone significant in their life. So taking this music with them is a way of taking that person with them. There's something else that's interesting about these musical memories when we look at them. You might imagine that they'd be randomly spread across people's lives, but they're not. We find that they peak around the ages of somewhere between 10 and 20. In fact, 50% of people's memories, even for people right into old age, came between the ages of 10 and 30. There's something very significant about this time that music is taking us back to over and over again. You may say that this is a radio program and this is why this is the case, but actually we've repeated this experiment on many people and we find the same pattern emerges over and over again. When we've been able to look at it in a more fine-grained way, we find that that peak is actually between the ages of 15 and 19, and it's very profound. Interestingly, we see the same pattern when we ask people for which pieces of music they prefer. They seem to be dated and released around that same time of their life as well. And even if you look at people's ability to recognize music instantly, you see exactly the same pattern. Now, you might think these things are related, and to some extent they are, but actually we can recognize music that we don't like at all. So they are different things, and they all show this same very robust effect. It's something that's been called the reminiscence bump, and we see it also for football players, for films, for books, for TV programs. So why does this happen? Well, the most obvious explanation is that this is when our brain is at its best for making memories. It's when we can lay down those memories best at any point in our life. That doesn't seem to be a complete explanation because it shifts around for different things. So a second possibility is that it's because we do lots of new things. It's when we first go to university or first go away from home for the first time. But it can also be maybe because those experiences are particularly emotional. In fact, all of these things are likely to be true, but the thing that we focused on that seems to be particularly important is that it's a time in our life when we make a lot of decisions about who we want to be, where we want to live, who we want to live with, what we believe in, who we want to spend the rest of our lives with. So they're very critical decisions, and they're decisions about our identity. On Desert Island Discs, Bruce Springsteen had a lovely example of this. When he was asked to choose songs, one of the songs he chose to take with him was I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. And he said that this song was really pivotal in his decision to become a guitarist. He said, this was a song that changed the course of my life. So he can take any song in the world with him to this desert island. And 3 of the songs he chose to take were songs that reminded him of his decision to become a guitarist. These memories, we call them self-defining memories, are incredibly important in terms of who we are. And we know when we see people who lose access to these memories how profound an effect it has. So for music to give us access back to those memories is really important. So I just want to talk about the ways in which music can connect us with ourselves, with other people, and also with a wider community. In terms of connecting with our identity, we have the kind of experiences that Bruce Springsteen described. One of our other participants talked about, she chose a song from The Sound of Music that she used to sing, and she remembered really vividly the moment where she sang into a hairbrush this song really loudly. And she became a singer. And that moment, again, to her was really, really important. We also go back to periods of time. So we might go back, in my case, I will go back to the 1980s because that's, again, my self-defining period. And interestingly, we will also often choose music that reminds us of a place. And what I've noticed with Desert Island Discs is that people are most likely to do this when they have been moved, when they've been displaced, or when they've chosen to move to another country. And they will very often want to choose a piece of music that takes them back to their roots, to their hometown, to where their cultural and personal identity resides. So music connects us with our identity, which, as I've said, is incredibly important, but it also connects us to people, to our key relationships. It's very, very common for people to choose a song that reminds them of their mother or their father. They really often will say, this is just them. I only have to hear this song and I'm with them. And it gives us that sense of attachment. People also very frequently choose songs that they play on holidays. So their family trips away where they would have a tape playing round and round and round, and that song reminds them of those summer holidays with their family. And they will also choose things that remind them of friendships. The reason that music is so central to those relationships is quite simply because music is built from the same building blocks that we use to communicate our important emotions. Our emotional signals like joy and distress and love and caring are all developed from the same things, which are melody, timbre, rhythm, and pitch. Those are the things we use to signal our own feelings and to connect with other people's feelings. So if we see somebody upset, we go, "Aww," and that's a musical sound. So music is the way in which we connect to people's emotions. And finally, music is a really important way for us to connect to others. We know that by listening to music together, it gives us a sense of collective identity. You've only got to look at people on football pitches or people singing in religious ceremonies to see how the music unites and bonds people and gives them that sense of collective identity. And there have been arguments made that this sort of collective participation in things like music and singing and dancing are almost part of our evolutionary success. They give us this sense of connectedness, which is completely vital to our survival as a human species. So they allow us to feel very, very connected with those people who are like us. But is there a danger that it can sometimes separate us from people who are not like us? Music, like laughter, is a sign of our sense and our group and our sense of identity. When we hear music that we don't like being played by people that aren't like us, we can sometimes feel even more distant. In the same way that if we hear people laughing and we're not part of that laughter, we can feel excluded by it. But I want to propose to you that one way that we can use music to connect with other people is to ask people about the songs that are important to them. The music they choose is irrelevant. It's the stories they tell. And one of the joys of my research has been able to ask people about their favourite songs and listen to their stories. And always there is a connection. There is a point of common humanity. So I want to suggest that while music can in some ways divide us at times, it can also be a route to connection. And I want to finish by quoting the opening of that Johnny Mathis song. So Johnny Mathis opens that song that I was talking about with this quote. He says, "I believe we can be more sensitive to our fellow man, that we can be better neighbours to each other." I want to suggest to you that music will help you to connect with your identity and yourself. It will help you to confirm the connections you have with your family and your friends and your culture and your shared identity. But I also would like to challenge you to go out to somebody who you don't normally speak to and ask them about the songs that are important to them. Listen to their stories. I guarantee you will find some point of human connection with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm sure we can all relate. I, for one, can think of many memories that have been enhanced by songs, and many songs which have been spoiled by memories. Songs that make me laugh, smile, cry, give me goosebumps, or make me remember people or situations that, to be honest, I wish I could forget. You've heard about the power of music, and guess what? Our next act is a strategically positioned musical performance. Originally from Uganda and here to uplift you with their African folk songs with an English twist are Dennis and Danny, known as the Ganda Boys.
Hello, my name is Dennis Mugaga.
And I am Danny Soagude.
And together we're the Ganda Boys. We're so happy to be here today to share this great moment with you. Our first song we're going to perform is called The Forgotten People. This song sheds a light on the plight of the displaced, the homeless, and the refugees around the world. We were inspired to write this song when we visited the refugee camp in northern Uganda, Adjumani, where we usually go to do our service work. While we were there, we took with us many basic needs that refugees would need. For those of you who don't know what's happening in northern Uganda, there's a civil war in southern Sudan, and refugees in big numbers have been settled in northern Uganda. Anyway, while we're there, we play, we sing, and we try to make them feel better in any way we can. But one special moment that stood out for us is a woman that came to us and said, "I've been a refugee all over East Africa, trying to find peace. We've received a lot of love and we've received a lot of pleasantries and gifts and many things, but we've not had someone come to address a certain important issue that is both cultural and very essential." And we were very intrigued and we wondered, what could that be? The lady told us it's menstruation. and its sanitation. Now, for a reason we were taken back, because our culture in Africa does not sit well with these terms, as you may well understand. Cut the long story short, the lady expressed the fact that many girls did not finish off school because they could not stay in class in the makeshift education centers littered around the refugee settlement camps, all because of the menstruation period, and that they would not be able to go to school, and therefore they got married off at a very early age. They become mothers long before they can actually take that responsibility on. That was a big one to deal with. She asked us to use our music to change the taboos and the stigma around menstruation and periods in women, and to also raise funds and collect as many reusable sanitary towels. I'm glad to let you know that in 2019, through one of our partners and through our concerts, we managed to raise enough sanitary towels to lift 2,500 girls out of period poverty in refugee camps in rural Uganda. Of course, COVID has taken us back, but we are looking forward to raising the awareness, using our music to clear the taboos around menstruation, and to also provide more reusable material for the girl child. Our first song. Can't feel the forgotten for all the days that are gone. Can't feel the longing or pain when your arms cannot carry on. The forgotten people, I know. The forgotten people that never come home. Never come home. On a dusty road with heavy load, counting down the days, ever since the people betrayed. Child, she cries, I wanna go home. No mommy, no daddy, lie still by the side of the road. Oh, forgotten the forgotten people will never come home. Never come home. Story never told, left out in the cold. Pain you can never know, hunting the faces of old. In the eyes of the children, what future do they hold in? The forgotten people, the forgotten people, they never ever come home. Never come home. The forgotten people, the forgotten people, never ever come home. Never come home. Thank you so much. The next song we're going to perform for you is a song that sort of bridges the gap between our culture and the ingenuity of the Western world and all the things that we don't have home and how best we can make use of them. And this song is about taking the bus, the double-decker bus.
Every story told, from the road you've always called your own, all the roads you've known, all the roads you've known. Gona yo tugende, gona yo tugende. Ganda boy, we take a bus, take a bus. Ganda boy, we take a train. Ganda boy, we take a plane, take a plane.
Oh, how much I miss a live music show. From London, we now go to the beaches of Dover, a familiar setting to our next speaker, who over the past years has dedicated much of her life to reporting about refugees. A journalist for the BBC, she has won the Amnesty International Investigative Reporting Award, breaking major stories about human rights violations. Her commitment is to the truth, unrelentless, however it may appear, and that's what she is here to tell you about. It is my utmost pleasure to introduce Sue Mitchell.
Last night, I was recording on the beaches alongside our famous white cliffs of Dover. In the darkness and far out at sea, you could just about make out small flickers of light. They were coming from mobile phones in the hands of migrants, people making the perilous crossing to England from France. They were using their phones to guide them as they huddled together in tightly packed dinghies. When they reached these shores, they were cold and frightened, but also happy and relieved. They'd survived a journey across one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, a journey that could have killed them. And once in Britain, they should be safe and have the chance of a better life. But what do we really know about these people? How can we, as journalists, do more to make sure that we're not being taken in? It's a question I wouldn't have even asked myself a year or so ago. And the reason I'm sitting here talking to you now is to reflect on a search for the truth in one particular case that I've covered. That case has taken me around the globe, and I'd like to share it with you. The story's about an Afghan family in Iran and a former British soldier, but we'll come to him later. At the heart of it is a mother, Goli, one of the bravest and most determined women I've ever met. And it's about what she did when her daughter was taken from the family home. You might be sitting there wondering what child abduction has to do with migrants heading to Britain. The story starts in the Calais jungle, a huge makeshift camp that's stretched out along sand dunes near the French border. Back in 2016, thousands of refugees were living there in tents. It was a kind of unauthorised holding camp for migrants determined to cross illegally into Britain by lorry or boat. People could be there for months, years even. There were shops and food stalls, even a makeshift mosque. I went there as a reporter for the BBC to cover the story of one little girl in that sea of refugees. Journalists have a responsibility to tell the world what's happening in these camps. What I learned is that it's hard to remain impartial and even harder to get to the truth. The migrants interviewed by reporters are usually men. Their stories about wars and persecution get cut down into sound bites for the news. As journalists, we easily miss the voices of women who come from cultures where they're often not allowed to speak up. I think it's a flaw in our journalism, but if you'd asked me about that back in Calais in 2016, I'd probably have told you that my instincts were good. I was an experienced reporter when I first met Goli's missing daughter, Bru, and her ex-husband, Reza. I was taken in and deceived by him. Some good eventually came from our meeting. It's taught me how nigh on impossible it is to tell an economic migrant from an asylum seeker, to make out the truth from the lies. And it certainly made me understand from bitter experience what I once knew only in theory, that in many parts of the world women are abused and denied justice. First, let me tell you about the little girl, Bru. When I met her in that Calais camp, she was instantly captivating. She was wearing bright pink Wellington boots. She was 4, and she had the biggest brown eyes and an impish grin. She didn't speak much English, but she was a great mimic. She'd listen and take a few phrases in and then run them together in a funny voice. Then she'd laugh, and I did too. I noticed that her dad didn't pay her much attention. I assumed he was just preoccupied, trying to get through each day in that camp. It wasn't right that Bru and so many other kids were living there, playing in filthy mud. It was bitterly cold. The wind swept off the sea and across the dunes. The camp stank from an open sewer that ran along the back of Bru's tent. When it rained, this effluent overflowed and snaked between the shelters. Bru and her dad Reza spent their days surrounded by the noise of different voices in different languages, people packed in together, talking about the lives they hoped to have in Britain. As night set in, they'd make campfires and share what little food they had. They talked about the countries they'd travelled through to get this far and the countries they'd fled. There were many more men in Calais than women. At first, I was a bit apprehensive approaching people in the camp, but the longer you're there, the more you relax. People tell you their stories willingly, how the smugglers operate, how much it costs to reach the UK. Reza said he didn't have enough money to pay smugglers. He'd need thousands to get a place on a lorry for himself, and the price for Bru was much higher. Children are risky. You never know when they might wake up and cry. I came into this story and met Reza and Bru because an attempt to smuggle Brew and send her on ahead to Britain from the camp had just gone very badly wrong. It was a big news story at the time. It made headlines around the world. You might remember it. It involved the former British soldier I mentioned at the start. His name's Rob Laurie. Rob had put his own life in the UK on hold to go to work as a volunteer in the Calais camp. He'd been moved by images of a little Syrian boy who died out at sea. Rob started driving his van back and forth from his home in the UK to Calais, bringing supplies, and that's how he'd met Brew. She followed him around as he was putting up shelters. Her father, Reza, told Rob that they were fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan, that his wife had been killed, and that they needed to reach relatives in the UK. The story touched Rob's heart. In a moment of madness, Rob did something completely out of character. He agreed to smuggle them both across the French border into Britain in his van. On a bleak, cold night, Rob pulled his van into a deserted side street near the camp. The van had a small compartment in the roof above the driver's seat. By torchlight, Reza tried to squeeze himself in. He couldn't, but there was enough room for Brew. As a mother, I'd never have handed my daughter to a man I barely knew. But Reza didn't hesitate. He said he'd follow later, and he gave Rob the address of an aunt in the UK who'd take Brew in. But they never got that far. When Rob pulled up at the French border in Calais, sniffer dogs picked up a scent from the van. Brew was discovered, and Rob was charged with smuggling. He faced up to 10 years in jail. He'd done something really stupid, on an impulse, out of pity for a refugee. It was Rob's poor skills at smuggling, but his big heart at trying, that caught the attention of the world's media. Lots of journalists, including me, descended on the Calais camp. Everyone wanted to meet Brew and find out why Rob had taken such a risk to help her. Every one of us was taken in. I did question Reza about fleeing Afghanistan and his dead wife. He showed me a letter he said was from the Taliban, and a translator confirmed it was a death threat. Reza also said he had another child, a baby son, that he'd had to leave behind with relatives. He hadn't left Brew, he said, because Afghanistan was so dangerous for girls. I've often discussed with Rob since then why we didn't nail down the details, but there wasn't really any way to do that. Reza said he'd had documents and family photos, but they were washed away at sea as he was crossing from Turkey to Greece. At the time, it didn't strike me as strange that that letter from the Taliban had survived. Hands up, we were had. In a small library in the Calais camp, there was a map of the world. Refugees were asked to place a pin by the countries that they'd come from. Brew's pin was in the wrong place. But it was only 2 years later that Rob and I found out that Reza had not been fleeing the Taliban. He'd taken his little girl from the family home in Iran. His wife wasn't dead. There was no baby son with relatives, but there was another daughter, Baran, that he'd abandoned along with his wife when he decided to head for Britain. Reza took Brew because a child makes it easier to claim asylum in the UK. The refugee crisis was a cover for Reza, who was an economic migrant. Brew was his ticket to a better life. That doesn't mean that all migrants are liars, of course not. Some would argue that immigration laws are so strict that people are forced to embellish their stories to fit the rules. Some people would allow much freer access by economic migrants to wealthier countries. But the difficulty in proving the truth of individual accounts means there may often be room for doubt. It places a much greater duty of impartiality on journalists, a duty to stand back a little, to allow for the possibility of lies. If we don't, we're telling something complicated much too simply. We're drafting a very superficial history, ignoring hidden injustices, different problems that need different solutions. When I first reported from the Calais jungle, I didn't imagine what I wrote would ever be read by Goldie, would bring a mother the hope she'd been longing for, that her child was alive. Goldie hadn't been able to contact Reza and Brew since he left the family home in Tehran. She'd been out with the baby that day and came back to find her husband and daughter gone. At first, Reza's family had taken her and Baron in, but over the weeks that followed, Goldie'd realised they'd known about his plan to try to join relatives in Britain. She overheard them speaking to Reza on the phone, but when Goldie begged to hear her little girl's voice, they refused. Goldie feared that they'd take her youngest child from her as well, that they'd one day shut their door on her, leaving her with nothing. She went to the police and tried to take a case through the courts in Iran, accusing Reza of abduction. Eventually, her own family raised the money to pay smugglers to help her go after Brew, taking her baby Baron in her arms. She travelled for weeks by foot across mountains and rivers, through forests and moving between safe houses but never feeling safe, always terrified she might be raped or attacked by smugglers. When she got to Turkey, she was reunited with her own mom, who'd gone there as a migrant many years before. Her mom wanted her to stay, but Goldie knew she needed to carry on searching for Brew. That journey was cut short in Denmark when Baron got sick. They were given asylum there, but the police and the Red Cross told Goldie there was little hope of ever finding Brew. Then one day, quite by chance, Goldie read the story of Rob Laurie, Brew and Reza, a story I'd written for the BBC News website. There was a link to radio documentaries I'd made, and Goldie heard my recordings of her husband and, more importantly, her daughter. A Danish refugee worker helped her to get in touch with me and Rob. Goldie had documents to prove her version of events. There were lots of them: birth certificates, police statements, court records and identity cards. We eventually offered to help her find her little girl, and that wasn't easy. By this time, the Calais camp had been demolished and Reza and Brew had disappeared. How we found them both is a story in itself. I recorded it with Rob Laurie, and you can hear it on our podcast, Girl Taken. How Goldie and Brew were reunited after 5 years apart. How we confronted Reza with the lies he told us in the Calais jungle. And in those recordings, there's also parts of the migrant experience that seldom get covered by journalists. What happens to people who arrive illegally and disappear into life in the West? We used social media to find migrants we'd met in Calais. Ziggy, who'd been smuggled to the UK on the back of a lorry and was now getting the education he'd dreamed of. Solomon, with his new flat in Glasgow. And Mustafa, who was too busy even to speak to us. He was now the manager of a car wash in Preston and was branching out into motor repairs. Looking back, we were struck by how many men in the Calais camp had had a single child with them. We spoke to an international human rights lawyer who'd noticed exactly the same thing herself, scanning the faces in the camps and boats. So many men with a single child, where were the mothers? Reza presented himself and Brew as refugees from war, but his life was never in danger. He'd left a wife and child to carve out a more prosperous future for himself, and he'd taken Brew to make things easier. Goldie had had an arranged marriage to a man who eventually took her daughter and left her behind. She and Reza were from Afghan families. Their parents had made it as refugees into Iran, and she says she's far from alone in what's happened to her. So I felt the last words should come from Goalie. In these COVID times, she can't be here with me. So instead I asked Goalie, how can we do better when it comes to reporting the truth? Goalie said we should try to remember that the first voices we hear, the loudest voices, are not always the most truthful. Sometimes we have to try harder, dig deeper, and hope that we can pick up the voices of the distant women who are made to whisper or to bottle up injustices. I'm proud to have been able to give voice to Goalie's story and to have played my part in finally tracing her little girl.
An unbelievable story. Thank you for sharing it with us, Sue. Feel free to check out Sue's podcast, Girl Taken, to hear more. From the transformation of lives to the transformation of art, our next speaker will show us how technology is transforming theatre. As a musician, amateur theatre aficionado, and tech enthusiast, I must admit that working with this speaker made me at times giddy with excitement. She is an award-winning producer and the first director of digital development at the Royal Shakespeare Company. Without further ado, I give you Sarah Ellis.
More than 60 years ago, Norbert Wiener wrote that to be successful in this new world, either the engineers must become poets or the poets must become engineers. I'd argue that this was always the case in theatre. I'm the Director of Digital Development at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and it's the first role of its kind within the organisation. And it's been specifically created to bring together artists and technologists, poets and engineers, to imagine the future of theatre. It came from an interest in the possibilities created by the profound changes and new technologies of the internet age. This is the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, the RST, in Stratford-upon-Avon. It's our home. And every night, over 1,000 people come here for a shared experience and bear witness to some of the best storytelling technology there is, the actor. But the actor at the heart of the play has always been supported by other technologies. The poet and the engineer have never truly been separated. And my role is a new one, but has always existed in different forms, because candlelight was a technology, electricity was a technology, the printing press was a technology, and we wouldn't have or be able to perform Shakespeare's plays today without that technology. Technologies of the time brought into the theatre and used as part of the theatre-making toolkit. Now, as we encounter new technologies, we see the new possibilities. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre I'm standing on today, here, right now, is not a photograph. It's a millimetre accurate scan captured using cutting-edge LiDAR technology and rendered into a games engine. We can do anything we like with this image. Our theatre is now not only a 3D space in real life, but a virtual 3D space too. This stage, a smart stage I'm standing on, means that we can connect and broadcast in 3D space too. Scanned in a pandemic, now more than ever, we see the desire for connection, liveness, togetherness, and storytelling. What a virtual 3D space allows us to do is not only to broadcast, but to redefine how we be together, working alongside each other with all the tools that we have to make theatre. But back to craft. Another great quote is by Arthur C. Clarke, who says, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And look no further than The Tempest, Shakespeare's last and arguably most magical and innovative play. In 2016, it was the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, and in the years leading up to it, our artistic director, Greg Doran, wanted to explore The Tempest through a 21st century lens. And I began my research in the place where we mainly go for our ideas now, the internet. During my search, I found a clip from the Consumer Electronics Show keynote speech from Intel's CEO. It was a small 2-minute YouTube clip, easily findable for those in the industry, but no connection with theatre. And watching the clip, I saw the promise of a virtual and physical world come together using augmented reality. I saw a whole whale on a screen, and then a whale leaving the screen and moving over people's heads in the auditorium. It was technology as magic. The people who were in that auditorium were trying to touch the whale above them and gasped in excitement seeing it transform. And it made me think about all those people who had heard a voice on a phone for the first time, all those people who ran out of the cinema thinking the train was coming towards them. Our relationship with the promise of magic is completely connected to the promise of theatre. I wanted to see what would happen by bringing this new technology into our theatre to create a virtual and real world come together and shift ourselves from the idea of digital as another space. Knowing no one at Intel, I emailed their customer service website and waited patiently for a response. And 2 weeks later, I had a reply with an email back saying, let's talk. From a call came an invitation to Stratford-upon-Avon, and from that invitation to a week-long visit, a team of poets and a team of engineers, both innovative, both visionary, but talking two different languages, meeting, eating together, and finding ways to imagine together. It was an Intel engineer who said, do you know we have enough processing power to render a character in real time? And in that moment, we didn't know what this meant at all. I mean, we couldn't conceive of the possibilities, and we literally didn't know what he meant. Processing power, rendering, these are not words that we were using in our world. But as he explained, we realized that this was puppetry, the movement of an actor driving a digital avatar in real time, a new way to represent that most magical of characters, Ariel, and a new way to bring to life the magic of Shakespeare's imagination. 2 years later, that vision took flight. 336 joints in the avatar, the equivalent to recreating every joint in the human body. 200,000 files running simultaneously to bring the avatar to the audience. 50 million times more memory than the first flight to space. So many tiny challenges solved through the creativity of two teams. What would we project onto the avatar? We tried some of the most high-tech and expensive different solutions, and at the end, we used simple technology of the double layering of a mosquito net. Those two worlds coming together made 140 performances, reaching over 100,000 audience members, broadcasting to over 500 cinemas, and more importantly, a contribution to the toolkit available for future makers of cinema and theatre. But more importantly, we had welcomed a new technology that crossed generations that brought them together. New audiences came in with the technology and went away with the Shakespeare, and our current audiences came in with the Shakespeare and out with the technology. And that was the start into our worlds where we were creating with our 21st century engineers, the coders, the programmers, developers, riggers, 3D modelers, motion capture artists, the new communities that we take with us now and imagine on this 3D virtual stage. Because the embrace of new technologies and forms has always allowed us to be more open. And this is the 7 Ages of Man, seen from As You Like It, performed for the first time, a volumetrically captured actor, performing the scene with a digitally engineered set created on your tabletop. Because the embrace of new technologies and forms has allowed us to be more open, to experiment on different digital platforms, and thus to expand and diversify our thinking about our audience, and conversely, to understand and harness our potential. It has shown how theatre is a driving force and can work alongside those who are solving problems to imagine and enable communities to stay open to the new tools and technologies that are taking us there. So let's converge this craft and connection, accelerated by a disruption of a pandemic. We are faced with a stark adaptation and new forms of connection. Some are born from necessary functional means, but as theatre makers, how can we get a sense of togetherness when we are apart? What if our audiences could breathe or gesture or the data from their own movement or mood? Many aspects of the nuance of connection in our real worlds connect with performances virtually? What if we pushed our technology to unlock new possibilities of the internet, to expand reach in real time, push server power to service our connection in real time, and move from puppetry and character to real-time connected worlds at scale? This is starting to happen. This stage becomes our stage, and our stages connect to become our world, and the promise of theatre is its liveness and being together. But what if you could choose your stage, make home your destination, not just as a sat-nav instruction, but as a space for live performance? We are experimenting with the feedback loop between the performer and the audience, and experimenting with virtual co-presence in how we can breathe together and be together and experience together. The UK cultural icon David Bowie once said, "Tomorrow belongs to those who see it coming." Because it shouldn't just be the engineer or the industry representative at the KES keynote holding the conversation about the future. Our future's connected, it's inclusive, and it's together. Where we go, we'll go with the technology. We'll be with our poets and our engineers and our audiences and our communities. To those who can see the technology differently and work with the engineers to imagine. And those who are open to explore. Our processing powers are more than faster, better, smarter. They are magical.
And with this eye-opening look at technology in the arts, we have reached the end of our first day. Thank you for sticking around with us and welcoming these new ideas. We hope you had a good time and that some of what you listened to this evening has left you thinking.
We would like to thank Julia, Giri, Catherine, Sue, Sarah, and Gander Boys for their invaluable contributions to our event today. A special thank you to our sponsors and event partners for their support. This include White Light, Fish Eye Group, London Business School, LBS Institute of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and David Foster. Finally, we would also like to say thank you to the entire TEDx organizing team and our advisors for making sure that this event was a success.
Rest. You deserved it. Tomorrow is the middle of the week, and the day after is our final day of TEDx London Business School. We'll see you then, same time, same place.